This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Welcome again to the Geography of U.S. Presidential Elections, and welcome as well to those who may be watching and listening to this lecture at iTunes University. Today and next Monday, again, I'm going to be talking about the history, or if you will, the geo-history of U.S. presidential campaigns and elections. That's a lot to cover. I hope today to get up to about 1900, but bear with me if I don't. Especially if you have questions, which you may well have, we may get a little bit delayed. In thinking over the history of U.S. presidential elections, I've been thinking as well about sort of take-home messages for today's election. What sort of connections can we see? One thing we may note is that financial panics are very often followed by a change in party, or at least they often have electoral consequences. That certainly happened with the Panic of 1837. Not quite as much with the Panic of 73, Panic of 93 definitely, and of course 29 absolutely. Another thing that we may note is that U.S. presidential campaigns have often been very vigorous, if you will. One way to think about it is they used to be nasty, brutish, and short. Now they're nasty, brutish, and long. We'll look at, well, for example, today, for all the problems we have, we don't have partisans following candidates and heckling them with infantile little rhymes, as happened in 1884, when Democrats would chant, Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, continental liar from the state of Maine. And Republicans would follow Grover Cleveland chanting, Ma, Ma, where's my pa? Because Cleveland was paying for a child support for a child he had out of wedlock. Well, it may well have been his child. Another takeaway message is that through at least since the 1840s, parties have often sought a populist message regardless of the actual composition of their campaign and their candidates. Again, we'll see evidence for this. Both parties have elements of the elite as their leaders, but both parties have often tried to have a common touch, if you will, and sometimes in not exactly an above-board manner. So we'll see some examples of that. A few other sort of generalities is that the U.S. political system favors a two-party system. There have been a few periods in U.S. history, particularly in the early years, when there really were not two well-identified parties. But over time, the two-party system reestablishes itself. We can't see any sort of consistency in the political ideology of the two parties. Yes, in general, one party has been more inclined towards business interests, and another party has been more inclined towards what you might say the politics of common people. But even there are times when you can be surprised by the way the parties and their candidates campaigned. Other aspects of liberal conservative ideology are all over the map, changing from period to period. There certainly were times when the Democratic Party was more conservative by many measures than the Republican Party. So we see this shifting ideological landscape sort of shifting underneath the feet of the political parties, which sometimes can lead to some confusion as to which party is in favor of what positions and what areas they get their support from. One thing that we can certainly see is that there are enduring geographical patterns to U.S. presidential campaigns. At the largest scale, the pattern has been one of north versus south, with the center states, the mid-Atlantic states, and then into the states like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio have been in a sort of swing position. That's very long-standing. And then the West has often occupied its own position, sometimes allying itself with the South, sometimes a little bit with the North, sometimes disappearing, sometimes forming a region of its own. There are periods in U.S. electoral history when there's been strong differentiation by region. Political scientists call this sectionalism. Geographers would more tend to call it regionalism. And then there are times when that pattern disappears altogether, and if you just look at maps of states, you don't see any geography at all. But if you go and look at maps of counties, then you can see patterns that are very clear and often very persistent. For example, in much of American electoral history, Tennessee was a Democratic voting state. Now, today it's a Republican voting state, but through most of its history, voting for the Democratic Party. Eastern Tennessee, on the other hand, very strongly Republican voting from the Civil War, and before that, actually voting for the Whig Party, the sort of predecessor of the Republican Party. That's a pattern that persists to this day. Much stronger Republican voting in Eastern Tennessee. And there are other patterns that go on for a long time and then, boom, suddenly disappear. A lot of very strong patterns that existed in many Midwestern states disappeared in the 1980s with the election of President Ronald Reagan. And we will look at some of these patterns as we go through the course. There are some political scientists and others who have tried to make sense of some of this. Daniel Elazar, a generation or so ago, wrote a fairly influential book where he divided states, and actually even below the level of state, regions of the country into moralistic, individualistic, and traditionalistic regions, linking the original Puritan settlers in New England as well as Scandinavian settlers in places like Minnesota and Wisconsin and later in other parts of the West, with a moralistic political philosophy that emphasized good government, reform, sort of a community ethos, and he contrasted that with an individualistic political culture that he identified originally with the Mid-Atlantic states and later with Irish immigrants, German immigrants to some extent, which he said lent itself to machine politics and a bit more corruption, and a traditionalistic region in the South, which is much more hierarchical and culturally conservative. In looking at all these maps of counties and state voting patterns, I'm not so sure how well that holds, but it's something interesting to think about. Certainly, as I think I mentioned before, states like Vermont have very distinctive voting patterns, which we may be able to link to these sorts of traditions. I'm not sure. It's something we can talk about, and we can certainly bring it up in the discussion forum on the course website. Some of you have had some very interesting comments on there, and I would thank you and also hope more people will join in that discussion. Well, let's go back now to the history. Anyone want to interrupt me with questions or comments, please feel free at any time. This was actually the second election, the first in 1789, but neither of them were significant insofar as they were non-contested election. George Washington was the only candidate, and he received all of the votes. Now, by votes here, I mean electoral votes, votes in the Electoral College. In this early period, actually, the state legislatures in most of the states chose the electors, and there was only popular voting for the electors in a few states. And actually, up until the 1830s, that was changing all the time. Different states sometimes would have a popular election for the electors, and then they'd switch back. South Carolina didn't do it till after the Civil War. But basically, by the 30s, you do get popular voting for the electors. And also, by that time, you get good county-level data. Earlier than that, a lot of the returns are lost. We just don't have it. Oh, and one thing I should mention, too, is a book that I wished I could have had everybody buy, and I wish I could show the overheads. It's the Historical Atlas of U.S. Presidential Elections by J. Clark Archer and several other geographers. And this has county-level maps all the way back. It's by far the most comprehensive source. It's about $150, so I didn't want to have people buy it. And of course, these are copyrighted maps, so I can't show them to you. But if you want to get down into the county level, that's the place to go, and I'd highly recommend it. So anyway, Washington, sort of the unanimous choice of all the states at the time. Washington did not want to see parties emerging. He did not want factionalism. But of course, factionalism emerged, and he actually was emerging in his 2 terms, emerging among the members of his cabinet with John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, forming one faction that became known as the Federalists, and actually that was the faction that Washington himself inclined towards. The Federalists wanted a strong national government. They wanted internal improvements. They wanted the government to put money into things like canals and roads. They wanted a fairly strong military, and basically they wanted to build a state. And the opposition, led by Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Monroe, and a few others, mostly Virginians, sometimes called Republicans at that time, sometimes called Democratic Republicans, sometimes simply called Jeffersonians. They were very skeptical of a strong state. They were afraid that would lead to a monarchy. They were afraid it would lead to tyranny, and they wanted diffuse power. They wanted the states to have most of the authority. They wanted a very small government. They wanted low taxation. And you can see, just hearing that you can understand why Jefferson is looked back to by both Democrats and Republicans today, because each group can take some of his ideas and sort of see them as his own. At the time, he was seen as, certainly by his Federalist competitors, he was seen as quite a radical, and often was seen as inclining much too much towards the French Revolution and to radical ideas that were spreading in Europe at that time. But he certainly was a small government type. The geography starts to appear in the first contested election, that between John Adams of the Federalists and Jefferson of the Democratic Republicans, or Jeffersonians, I think we should probably call it, in 1796. And what this map does, again, is just showing you the electoral vote. It's showing you the states that were won by Jefferson, but you can see that a number of states divided their electoral votes. And actually, the map makers, this is from a Wikipedia map. I like those because I can use them without any problem in a class like this. I've actually done a pretty good job of showing where you did have divided electoral votes in places like Virginia and North Carolina. It was the seaboard areas that inclined towards the Federalist position and the interior areas more towards this Jeffersonian one, because the Federalist position was the position that was taken by people with strong mercantile interests, with close connections to Europe, particularly to Britain, close trade ties there. They wanted a pro-British rather than a pro-French foreign policy, and they wanted the U.S. to build up a strong national government. It was an interesting election because because of the fact that Jefferson ended up as the vice president, even though he was the opponent. They hadn't really figured out how to do it at this time. The system was all the electors got 2 votes, and they were supposed to pick the president with one and the vice president with another. But what happened if they both got the same number of votes? Then, what are you going to do there? Then one elector is always supposed to recuse himself and not vote for the vice presidential candidate. In this case, though, Alexander Hamilton was doing some machinations because he hated John Adams, a fellow Federalist, so much. He didn't want to get him elected. Anyway, it's a complicated story, but Jefferson ended up as the vice president. So it was kind of a problematic election. And the next election was even more problematic, and again, it goes back to these personality conflicts. But Jefferson ended up getting the same number of electoral votes as his vice presidential running mate, Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr refused to step down. It had to go to the Congress, and eventually Hamilton supported Jefferson. That was one of the things that led Hamilton and Burr to their famous duel, where Alexander Hamilton was killed by Aaron Burr. One of the things you can see comparing this map to the previous one, if we toggle back, we can see the extension of Jeffersonian support. And definitely in this early period, the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, if you will, are doing well. Gaining some support in the mid-Atlantic states, particularly in New York. You can see Virginia at this time had more electoral votes than any other state, but New York had quite a few, and that was key. Otherwise, the geographical patterns pretty similar. New England strongly Federalist, as well as the more coastal areas of the mid-Atlantic states, and then the interior and the far south, much more Jeffersonian, although South Carolina also had quite a bit of Federalist support as well. This was a nasty election, like so many of them. Here's a Federalist insult of Jefferson, a mean-spirited, low-life fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father. Now, I bring that in because of the racial overtones, and they're very clear, and we can find those through much of American history. Warren Harding was accused of having African-American ancestors. That was actually involved in the 1920s, so it's come in many times. Then we can see the regional insults coming in. raised solely on hoe cake made of coarse ground southern corn, along with bacon and hominy with an occasional change of fricasseed bullfrog. Of course, the Jeffersonians, I should say Adams and Jefferson weren't doing this themselves. They were friends, although, well, that friendship was pretty frayed by the end of this. But the Jefferson supporters calling Mr. Adams a fool, hypocrite, criminal, and tyrant in one continued tempest of malignant passion. It's a little bit more reserved, I suppose, but you get the sense. Jefferson turned out to be a very popular president, and one of the reasons for his popularity came with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which almost doubled the size of the United States and was purchased from France at a pretty low price. Very popular in most of the area, although it certainly had its opponents. A lot of New Englanders were worried. They were worried about the West becoming too strong. They were worried about New England losing its influence, New England with its commercial ties to the Atlantic world. And here is a very different part of the country without those sort of Atlantic connections, so that was a concern. And they certainly viewed Jefferson as hypocritical. Here's Jefferson, the big opponent of a strong federal government. And indeed, when Jefferson got into power, he greatly reduced the size of the government, reduced taxation rates as well. But yet, when he had the opportunity for expansionism, he took it. So to Federalists, there was a kind of a view of Jefferson as being hypocritical. But like I say, it was a popular move. And by the election of 1804, Jefferson running against Pickney from South Carolina, Federalists trying to do the regional balance. That's something interesting, too. You'll see this again and again. Federalist strength was in New England and Delaware, Maryland to some degree, parts of New Jersey and New York, but yet wanting to appeal to the South, they chose a candidate from South Carolina where there was some federal support. Yes, a question?
Why is Massachusetts and Maine combined?
Oh, Massachusetts didn't be, yeah, question is why are Massachusetts and Maine combined here? Maine was a district of Massachusetts until 1820, and then the Compromise of 1820 to balance Missouri coming in as a slave state, Maine then became a separate non-slave state because there was a real concern to balance. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. You can see even Massachusetts going for Jefferson, although fairly narrowly at this time, but it did, really withering of Federalist support. If you look at maps that show some of the county data that we have, it's not quite as much of an overwhelming election for Jefferson as it may appear there, but it's still very clear. And Jefferson was really hoping this is going to be the end of factionalism. This is going to be the end of party politics. Well, of course it wasn't. Question?
So I noticed by this time, only one state is splitting their votes, Maryland.
Yeah, you know, that's interesting. The question is only one state here is splitting their electoral votes. And it changes a lot. It's not consistent there. Some states will split their electoral votes for a while, and then they won't. They'll go back to the unified electoral vote.
So it went back and forth?
It went back and forth with many states. As I said last week, it's only Maine and Nebraska now that split them. But New York, for a long period of time, split its votes. But it sort of depends on the whims of the state legislatures and how they decide to handle that issue. Okay, where are we? 1804. 1808, the Federalists regained ground. Again, with Pickney as candidate. Well, maybe the other Pickney. There were two brothers. Not too important. You can see actually New York here dividing their vote at this time with their favorite son, George Clinton. We can see some revival of Federalist strength here, and that had to do with the embargo that was created in the same year. In Europe, you had the Napoleonic Wars going at full scale. U.S. merchant shippers were caught in the middle between the French and the British, and Jefferson and later Madison's policy was to use an embargo against both the French and the British, which was something that was devastating to New England shippers. And it's interesting, the U.S. foreign policy has very often had this policy of using economic sanctions against other countries doing things that the United States didn't want. This embargo, most historians would say, was not very successful, and it certainly was damaging. Here's a little New Hampshire Song from the time our ships all in motion, once white in the ocean, they sailed and returned with a cargo. Now doomed to decay, they have fallen a prey to Jefferson, worms, and embargo. So this was not popular in Massachusetts or in Delaware, many parts of the Chesapeake Bay, and others. So new life breathed into this Federalist position. New life comes and it goes. And what really undid the Federalists was the War of 1812. War against Britain. And again, this had to do with the impressment of sailors by British ships, taking American ships and forcing U.S. sailors to, forcing them into the Royal Navy. A lot of it had to do with Western policy, though. And you can see, with the exception of what is now West Virginia, the western counties, well, you can see it in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Tennessee, western New York, western areas very much in favor of this war. And one of the reasons why was the territories in the Northwest as well as in the Southeast. In the Northwest, there were continuing hostilities with Native Americans, Indian wars going on, and the Western settlers blamed the British for supporting these various different tribal confederations that were fighting against the U.S. And its settlers. They feared that the British, with their base in Canada, wanted to take over this northwestern territory that had been ceded to the United States at the end of the Revolutionary War. What this map doesn't show, actually the map is not entirely accurate, because the Spanish controlled not just Florida, but what was then called West Florida, which is the southern part of what is now Mississippi and Alabama, even part of what is now Louisiana. Southern settlers wanted to get this territory. They were afraid that the British were going to come in, sort of surround the United States. So there was a real movement for war by a group of congressmen known as the Young War Hawks. Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun were their leaders, and they were pushing hard for war. New England, mid-Atlantic states, dead set against this. They've had strong trading relations with Britain, and the last thing they wanted was to go to war. They also didn't want stronger power in the western states, fearing that would dilute their own power. Here's some other maps that show it. So here was Spanish Florida at the time, and you can see West Florida coming all the way over to Baton Rouge even. And through the Louisiana Purchase, the United States had the Mississippi River, but Spain had claims all the way up to it. Earlier, they had even claimed this area here. And then you can see, actually, in the conduct of the War of 1812, most of the battles were along this boundary with Canada into Ohio, and then a number of other battles down here. Those were sort of the main theaters of the war. In 1812, you can see that New England, with the exception of Vermont, which is interesting, part of the mid-Atlantic, including New York, very much against Madison, the president who was agreed to conduct the War of 1812 against the British. You can see it's called a fusion party, not the Federalists, because an important branch of the New York Democratic Party broke with the Democratic Republicans over this issue, I should say, of the New York Democratic Republican Party, because, again, it threatened New York's commercial interests abroad, commercial interests with Britain. At least that's how it's usually understood. How did the war go? Most historians would consider it a draw. The most important battle, the Battle of New Orleans, happened after the peace settlement had been reached. The United States did not gain territories, but didn't lose it. And actually, there was a tremendous pride that the U.S. had fought the British imperial system to a draw. Federalists ended up totally discrediting themselves. There was so much anti-war sentiment in New England that political representatives met in Hartford, Connecticut, signed the Hartford Declaration, where they threatened to withdraw from the United States. They were talking about secession. By the time the war was over, the Federalists were pretty much finished, and that was the main reason. That was they were seen as having been disloyal. But there's an irony as well. Well, you can see the next election, 1816, they're still getting some support. By 1820, that disappears altogether. There's an irony here, though. in that the Democratic Republicans, starting with Madison and continuing with Monroe, they actually took on the Federalist Project. Madison's an interesting character. I mean, he was the main author of the U.S. Constitution, or one of the main authors of the Constitution. And at that point, he was aiming for fairly strong federal control. Then he became an ardent Jeffersonian and wanted small federal government and lots of states' power. But the War of 1812 changed his mind. He decided if the U.S. is going to have a place in the sun and is going to be competing with the likes of the British Empire, it needed a strong government. It needed a government that will invest in internal improvements. It needed a national bank to stabilize its currency. It needed high tariffs. These were all, or at least it needed significant tariffs. These were all the old Federalist projects taken into what had been the enemy of the Federalists. You can see by 1820, this new sort of Democratic-Republican system won almost entirely. One electoral vote. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, very embarrassed to get this vote. He didn't want it. Why did he get it? Because it was thought that only Washington should have a unanimous victory. So somebody had to throw their vote away so they wouldn't be insulting the great founder of the country. This period is sometimes called the era of good feelings because it looked as if sectionalism, or we might call regionalism, as well as this division into competing parties, it looks like it had died down. There were indeed some of the old Jeffersonians angry with the direction the country was taking, and they would later gain strength again. But at least for the nonce, it looked pretty well. Also, this was a period when the United States was really putting itself forward. Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, instrumental in formulating the Monroe Doctrine, emphasizing U.S. influence in Central and South America. So the U.S. sort of finding its place and its voice. Well, of course, something like this is never going to last, right? It can't last. And it doesn't last. And where did we jump up? Oh, well, and one of the things that was changing it was the increase of basic democratic governance. What this map shows is, it's actually a little bit later, 1840, but it's showing states that have heavy property qualifications for voting. It's hard to see from this the difference, but then some states here with light property qualifications, tax-paying qualifications. We have, at this time, only two states with universal male suffrage, Vermont and Maine, and then a number of states with universal white male suffrage, which would be the Western states. The Western states were pushing a much more democratic form of government. Not obviously entirely democratic, women not voting, blacks, Native Americans not voting, but getting rid of these sort of property qualifications. This begins what some would call the era of the common man and new kind of politics. You know, hitherto, U.S. politics have been highly deferential, deferring to those of sort of wealthy merchant or virtually aristocratic background. They had all been from Massachusetts or Virginia, well, almost all of them Virginia, from wealthy planter backgrounds. Well, things are going to start to change, and this is one of the reasons, the new Western states and their much more democratic governance. 1824, a very interesting election. You can see no parties. Remember, parties had disappeared, but that doesn't mean that you don't have factions and you don't have people disagreeing. There was an effort to select Crawford, William Crawford, who was Treasury Secretary. He was supposed to be the heir apparent, just as Jefferson had picked Madison, well, sort of, and Madison had picked Monroe. So Crawford was selected. He had a debilitating stroke, which made him not exactly the best candidate. And so instead what you find is regional candidates emerging. For example, here's John Quincy Adams. You can see where his support is. He's from Massachusetts, and his support is all New England and New York. Virtually no support elsewhere. You have Henry Clay, who had been one of these war hawks in Kentucky, and his support is basically the Ohio River Valley. A lot of support in Indiana and Illinois as well. But base of support here. You have Crawford, despite his stroke, still getting votes in Virginia and Georgia. That's no surprise. He was from Georgia, and Virginia had been the sort of seat of this almost dynastic or aristocratic politics that preceded it. The interesting individual here, the one who you can see on the map here who sort of escapes this regional pattern, is Andrew Jackson, who is a completely new kind of politician. He is from the frontier. He had been a general in the War of 1812, successful general in the Battle of New Orleans. He had made quite a bit of money, was not very well educated, although obviously a very intelligent man, who ended up propounding this new political philosophy aimed at the common man, if you will. At the same time, ideological disputes were coming into play as well. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay were in favor of this, what Clay called the American system, this what originally had been the Federalist plan after War of 1812 became the Democratic Republican plan as well, of a strong government, of a government that's going to engage in internal improvements, build roads and canals and the like, which you can note too, very popular in the Ohio Valley, where farmers are desperate to get their crops to markets. Going down the Mississippi, what they mostly did, pretty difficult. They wanted roads and canals to link them to the east, and they wanted the federal government to push that forward. They wanted, certainly the New Englanders wanted high tariffs. Manufacturing is developing now. They want to protect the U.S. infant manufacturers from British competition. So they want this system. They want a national bank. They want a strong currency. Whereas Crawford and especially Andrew Jackson, they're hearkening back to the old, more Jeffersonian form of politics. They don't want a strong national government. They want the constituent states to have most of the power. They don't want a big army. They don't want tariffs. They don't want the U.S. government to be funding these internal improvements. They want a low-tax regime, and they're going to push it forward. It's an interesting term for what happened in this election. Well, who won? Well, there's the electoral vote count. Yeah, no winner. So how's it going to work its way out? Goes to the Congress. And this is the famous election that some refer to as the election of the corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain was that that Henry Clay, through his support to John Quincy Adams, that was enough for John Quincy Adams to become president, and afterwards Henry Clay becomes Secretary of State, which had been the most important stepping stone to the presidency. That infuriated the Jacksonians, and they started plotting their revenge, if you will. One thing to note, though, how do we explain Andrew Jackson's pattern here? Well, no surprise that he has a lot of support in the Southeast. That's his region, the Southwest, places like Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama. No surprise that's where he's from. Support in far western states like Illinois and Indiana. That's no surprise either. But how do we explain Pennsylvania, especially Pennsylvania, where he had a lot of support? Well, I don't know how to explain it, but some people explain it on the basis of this map, the Scots-Irish background. Andrew Jackson was Scots-Irish. By Scots-Irish, we mean the Protestants of Northern Ireland, who had originally come from Scotland. They were settled by the English crown in Northern Ireland, and then many of them migrated to the United States in large numbers. And there's a lot of interest in the Scots-Irish. They were sort of the quintessential frontiers people. Yes, question in the back?
Wouldn't Pennsylvania at that point in history be considered the frontier, more aligned with Ohio, Indiana, and those areas, or was it still an eastern state?
Certainly western Pennsylvania. Yeah, the question is, with Pennsylvania more sort of a frontier area? Pennsylvania has this sort of duality. Certainly, for Philadelphia, that's where the National Bank was headquartered. That was as much of a core as any other place of the United States at this time. But western Pennsylvania was a frontier area, and you can see on this map that's where the Scots-Irish were very heavily settled. So North Carolina, parts of South Carolina into Tennessee, parts of the Appalachian Mountains a little bit further north, and also some up in Maine and New Hampshire. And we'll see later, Maine and New Hampshire often have divergent voting patterns from the rest of New England. When Vermont was the most consistently Republican voting state in the country, New Hampshire was often voting for Democrats. So some difference there, which may have something to do with this. I'm skeptical of any explanation which would say that, yeah, we can explain this solely on any one factor, this one or any other. Catalog of General Jackson's youthful indiscretions, disseminated by his political opponents, tracing out 14 duels, fights, shootouts, and general free-for-alls. His intemperate life and character render him unfit for the highest civil appointment, and there are also accusations of adultery, gambling, cockfighting, bigamy, slave trading, drunkenness, theft, lying, and murder. So we're pretty much getting everything into the system. Whereas the Jacksonians, looking at President John Quincy Adams, accused him of being a reckless spendthrift who lives in kingly pomp and splendor and plays billiards and chess. Actually, he bought his own billiard table, supposedly, but didn't play well on the frontier, evidently. A Unitarian who travels on Sunday, had premarital relations with his wife, and procured an American concubine for the Tsar of Russia. He had actually been, back when his father was president, he had been U.S. representative in Russia at the time. I don't know anything about whether or not he did any procuring, but the insults came fast and furious. Well, anyway, in the following election, 1828, Andrew Jackson came through. John Quincy Adams still had most of New England. He had a good support in New York, and even though New York wasn't voting on regional lines, his support was very much in western New York, this area, very interesting area we'll talk about. Some support here in the eastern seaboard, New Jersey, Delaware, parts of Maryland. He certainly had some support in Henry Clay's current zone here in Kentucky and the Ohio River Valley, but not enough to win those states. You can see the popular vote pretty one-sided, 56% to 44, and the electoral vote very much so, 68 to 32. So you can consider it sort of a bit of a landslide for Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson came through and, I'm sorry. And again, this is a map that at least on my computer, you can see it much clearer, where we can see very, very heavy voting for Jackson in the far southwest, which was then the far southwest, much lighter in the Ohio River Valley, and with John Quincy Adams, very heavy support in places like Massachusetts. What are a few things Andrew Jackson did? Well, he ended the Second Bank of the United States, refused to renew its charter. Here is a Jacksonian campaign poster showing the head of the bank as the devil himself. The National Bank was seen by the Jacksonians as an implement of the financial elite to take advantage of the common people. Again, it's interesting to look at what's happening right now, and you can see there are some patterns that continue over a long period of time. Andrew Jackson had been a fighter against the American Indian tribes, and he ordered the removal of the so-called 5 civilized tribes. By civilized, these were groups of Indians that were modeling their own institutions on the United States. The way they thought they could maintain their lands was to act like Americans, establish their own constitutions, become literate, buy and sell African slaves, the whole works of what was going on. Well, it wasn't enough. Jackson, against court orders, against the courts of the United States, ordered them removed to Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears, vast number of casualties and deaths at that time. A very sorry experience. Well, another thing he did was come into conflict with a man who had been his vice president, John C. Calhoun. I just love that photo. I know you just see I don't know if there's anyone with the sort of intensity of look of John C. Calhoun and that. From South Carolina, He had been one of the war hawks. Yes, question?
He looks an awful lot like John Brown.
Like John Brown, yeah. A fire. You can just see the fire in their eyes. Very interesting. Of course, absolutely on the opposite side of the issue of slavery. Calhoun, very much the defender. I mean, he didn't just think slavery was okay. He thought it was a positive good, something that should be extended as much as possible. But he had been vice president, but broke with Jackson over the issue of states' rights. Jackson was basically a states' rights candidate, but with limits. And when Calhoun and others in South Carolina said that South Carolina could nullify acts of Congress and ignore them, this is in particular over a tariff issue, Jackson threatened South Carolina with a military invasion, which led to South Carolina certainly turning away from the Jacksonian system. So anyway, Jackson was popular, but he certainly had his enemies. You can see in the next election, 32, Jackson wins decisively. Popular vote, 55%. You can see South Carolina not going for Jackson at all, choosing someone of their own liking. Henry Clay running again, one of his 3 attempts. Getting support in his native Kentucky, as well as quite a bit of support in the Ohio Valley. Again, Clay is the one more than anyone else who's pushing for the American, what he called the American system of strong federal government, high tariffs, internal improvements, investment in the country. He's getting support in New England, Massachusetts, in some of the mid-Atlantic states. Again, these more commercially oriented ones. But overall, he's not getting many votes at all, 25% you can see. And then you can see 20% for Wirt, the anti-Masonic candidate. Yes, there's a question in the back.
To what extent was ongoing immigration, in addition to the Scots-Irish part, affecting this?
Yeah, the question is what was the effect of ongoing immigration? At this point, yes, it was certainly played a role, but it played a much later role, a little bit later. In the 1840s is when you saw the huge surge of Irish and German immigrants into the United States. That had a big impact, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So it was a bit more muted at this time, but if you wanted to really look at it in detail, yes, it's something you'd have to look into. Anti-Masonic party, well, it looks like a one-issue party, right? And a party that's not going to last. Well, that's true. It didn't last at all. It's very important. They were the first party to have a nominating convention. The other parties had, originally they had congressional caucuses where the congressional representatives would get together and pick a candidate. But that didn't work very well in this more democratic age of Jackson, and they hadn't figured out really how to pick a nominee. And it was the anti-Masonics who did so, and then others followed them very quickly. So that's where we get the convention. That's what nominating convention. They won Vermont, but this, you have to look at the map that shows state patterns to really see it. This movement began in western New York. It was very powerful in Pennsylvania, powerful in much of New England, got a lot of votes. Well, why anti-Masonic? Democratic age, real fears of an elite conspiracy. And lo and behold, Andrew Jackson, for all of his frontier trappings and his common man touch, was a member of the Masons, as was Henry Clay, as was many of these individuals. And a lot of people thought the Masons had a secret conspiracy. There had been a prominent murder of a Mason who supposedly was going to tell all, and that led to this outpouring of anti-Masonic sentiment. There's a real interesting geography to it. This anti-Masonic movement began in what is called the burned over district of western New York. This is along the Erie Canal in the western part of the state. Anyone know why it's called what's called the burned over district? Burned over by the fires of evangelical fervor. Something called the Second Great Awakening in the early decades of the 1800s. Religious revival movement, and it was more concentrated in this part of western New York than anywhere else. So the notion was that everyone here had been converted and there was no one else to convert. Hence burned over district. This is what gave rise to the Mormon religion, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. First seances in the United States evidently happened in this area, and as well as this sort of new political movement. Later maps, if we look at county level maps, we'll see this eventually became a very Republican voting area around the age of Lincoln. Extraordinarily high levels of support for Lincoln, Fremont, and the other early Republican candidates. 1836, Washington had set a precedent by only running for 2 terms. And so up until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, other presidents thought that they should follow Washington's model and only run twice. So what you have in the party, and notice now we're calling it the Democratic Party, the Jacksonian Party became the Democrats. Martin Van Buren of New York, sometimes called the Little Magician. Van Buren was Jackson's main strategist. He was really the architect of this Jacksonian movement more than anywhere else. So he became then the successor. The anti-Jacksonians now call themselves Whigs, which actually is borrowing from the British term. In Britain, the Whigs were the party that wanted more power for the Parliament and less for the monarchy. And the Whig movement viewed Jackson as taking on too much power for himself. This is sort of ironic. So Jackson was a person who wanted a small federal government, but a strong executive. Whereas the Whigs wanted a strong federal government, but they wanted congressional authority rather than this strong executive authority. And at this point, they decided on a very interesting geographical strategy. There was no one they could run at the national level against Jackson. What they had to do was pick regional candidates, run against Martin Van Buren, hope to get enough support to deny Van Buren 50% in the Electoral College and throw it to the House of Representatives. Didn't work out that way. Martin Van Buren actually got a majority of the vote and certainly won the Electoral College very handily. Daniel Webster only really getting support in his native Massachusetts. William Henry Harrison, a general who had been highly decorated, well, that's actually debatable, but anyway, had fought in the War of 1812 and against the American Indians, doing well in the West, South Carolina going its own way, a Southern candidate, White, doing well here. Overall, compared to the earlier election, the anti-Jacksonians picked up votes. They really started picking up votes in the South, which had been solidly Jacksonian. Some of the wealthy planters, the aristocrats, actually gaining number. This is the period when cotton is really coming into Mississippi and Alabama. You're really getting plantation economies there. A lot of these wealthy planters distrusted the populism of Jackson and of Martin Van Buren. They wanted more sort of elite control. They made political connections with the New England proponents of strong government, the Ohio River Valley proponents of strong government, and created this Whig party. They also tried to capitalize on whatever they could. The fact that Martin Van Buren's vice presidential running mate, Richard Johnson, was living with a woman of partially African-American background was a big issue in the campaign. Again, playing the race card that goes way back in American history. In this case, it didn't work, and Van Buren was the winner. One other thing that the nascent Whig Party was trying to do, though, was to turn the tables as far as populist rhetoric goes. Andrew Jackson, I mean, he was the man of the people, right? They say he can only spell one word in 4 correctly, self-educated and the like. Martin Van Buren, his successor, was not a frontier man. He was from New York. And David, known to history mostly as Davy Crockett, a Whig a politician from Tennessee, did everything he could to turn the tables. He hated Jackson. They were rivals. They were both from the same state. And they had a lot of similarities. But on the political issues, they were on opposite sides. So David Crockett wrote a book, The Life of Martin Van Buren. One quote from it, he travels about in an English coach, has English servants dressed in uniforms. I think they call them livery. No longer mixes with the sons of little tavern keepers, is so stiff in his gait and prim in his dress that he is what the English call a dandy. He struts and swaggers like a crow in a gutter and laces up in corsets like women in town wear. So we can see here's the populist card being played by the party, which in general is more the party of the commercial and the plantation elite, to some degree, at any rate. The Whigs were very much helped by the financial panic of 1837, the second big financial panic that happened in the United States, a bank run. Here's one of their election posters. I have no money, cannot get any work. Basically, we're desperate. What are we going to do? And we can blame it on Martin Van Buren. He's president after all. So again, this happens many times in U.S. electoral history. In the next election, the election of 1840, the Whigs agree on one candidate, William Henry Harrison, who had run previously. He's now going to run at the national level. And William Henry Harrison was sold as a man of the people. His election campaign, this is often considered the first modern electoral campaign. Lots of money put, people that today would call election consultants, working to try to craft an image and to use visual imagery to sell him. William Henry Harrison was actually the scion of one of the most distinguished families of Virginia. He is college educated. He had a mansion near the Ohio River, but he had spent a little time at one point in his life in a log cabin, evidently, and he drank hard cider, the drink of the people. This is when Johnny Appleseed was going around planting apple trees. Well, that was all about alcoholic beverages. That was all about hard cider. And so here I have, I put the title here, Joe's Six-Pack of 1840, but trying to portray William Henry Harrison as this popular candidate, and it was quite successful. One thing you can see, too, is you can see we keep adding new states as we go along. But in this election, the Whig candidate, William Henry Harrison, winning New England, although you can see New Hampshire, a state apart, as it often would be. You can see through the Mid-Atlantic, much of the Ohio River Valley, and a lot of areas in the South as well. This is a pattern. You don't see much of a geographical pattern when you look at the states. You have to look down below that at the county level to start picking out some interesting patterns. And I'm sorry I can't show you any maps. I don't have any. But there are some interesting ones that we can see. Yes, question?
Am I mistaken, or is this the first election where the candidate didn't carry his own state? Van Buren didn't carry New York.
Van Buren did not carry New York. Yes, that's interesting. I'd have to go back and look. Yeah, the question is this the first where the candidate did not carry his own state? There certainly have been a number of elections where that's true. We usually think that the candidate's going to have a real advantage in his home state, and that generally is true, but it doesn't always work out that way. It's interesting. New York during this period was the real quintessential swing state, could go either way. Increasingly important. You can see now it's 42 electoral votes, more than any other state. So this is a period where New York is really becoming the commercial core of the country, more and more important, and many, many candidates out of New York in subsequent generations because of that increasing electoral importance because of its population.
But South Carolina votes with everybody else.
South Carolina. Yes, South Carolina is no longer in its sort of aberrant way. And at this time, South Carolina is the only state that is picking its electors through its legislators rather than through any sort of popular vote. Yes, another question?
I'm surprised to see Florida is a territory. What kept it from statehood?
Yeah, why is Florida a territory? Florida came in, 1818. Before that, it was not part of the United States. It was a Spanish territory. And at this point, it was very much a frontier. Florida was tropical swampland with very few settlers. And the initial settlers are coming into the northern part of Florida. And this is where the southern plantation economy is moving in. Southern Florida and Central Florida, they didn't get settled till much later, and a lot of the settlers there came from much further north. That's why Northern Florida is southern and Southern Florida isn't. So there's an odd sort of cultural difference in that state, or isn't as much to the same extent. Yeah, that is an interesting point because it doesn't fit the general westward movement of states. Here it is all the way on the East Coast and not yet a state. Like I say, I'd like to be able to show you the county maps because there's some real interesting things we could see. One is if we go to Alabama, what's called the Black Belt, which is these counties here. And if anyone looked at the discussion on the web forum, there's some interesting points being made about this part of Alabama. Today, these are the Democratic voting counties of Alabama. At the time, 1840, this was the Whig voting part. This was the part that voted for William Henry Harrison, that rejected Martin Van Buren. Why is that? It's actually, to explain this, we can go back to the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, when a chalky limestone rock developed that later became a geological formation here, which later became a biogeographical formation. We're showing the original vegetation here, saying soils, but it's really vegetation, prairies or grasslands in this black belt. This is by far the richest soil area of Alabama. This chalky limestone produces a very fertile black soil, and that's black belt originally for its soil. Black, rich soil where cotton could be cropped year after year. In most other parts of the South, you could crop it for a while, and then the soil's exhausted, and you abandon it for a while, and then maybe return when the fertility builds back up. But this was one of several areas in the South that had good soil, and it became the focus of this plantation economy. That meant that the most of the white population here were wealthy plantation owners with a lot of black slaves, and at this point, the wealthy plantation owners were not inclined towards the somewhat more populist party of Jackson, this new Democratic Party. They made alliances with the Whigs. They had close commercial ties with New York, where the cotton was taken and sold, and those were reflected here in the policies. You can see here 1860 slave population. You can see the black belt here very, very clearly. And it's interesting to go through the years and see how this area votes. In the late 1860s, 1870s, it voted heavily Republican because there was a short period when the slaves, now freed, could vote. And they voted for the party that had been the party of emancipation. Today, it votes Democratic, African-American majorities, very clear majorities, again, because of this old plantation system. So now voting for the Democratic Party. So some of these patterns we can explain essentially by geology and the like. Other places are, we can see here again, here's the Black Belt cotton production areas. There are other places that were similar along the Mississippi River where there's more fertile soil. You can actually see the same sort of patterns. Ohio is really tricky. The only map I could show with county level voting, well, they're in the book, but one that I could actually show you, earliest I could find is 1872, Democrats versus Republicans, Democrats in blue, Republicans in red. But the patterns with the Whigs versus the Democrats, they're the same pattern, and these patterns just keep repeating over and over and over again. And it's led to a lot of curiosity why these different areas have these political leanings. They eventually disappeared in the 20th century, but they maintained all the way up to about early 20th century. Yes, comment in the back? Yeah, okay, the point is this part of Ohio settled by people from Connecticut. This is the area known as the Western Reserve, and it was the Western Reserve of Connecticut. So it was sort of Connecticut Yankees coming in with this strongly, what had originally been Federalist and then Whig and then later Republican political leanings, wanting a strong national government, became a real seat of abolitionism. And those patterns continued. Yeah, one way to explain it is precisely by the settlement pattern. You can see another group of Republican counties here, which were also Whig counties. This is called the Virginia Military Tract. And it was settled by people from Virginia who didn't like the Virginia slave system. And they came across into the free country of Ohio. And then they became very strongly of Republican voting. And then there was the Ohio Company land here. These areas also became strongly Republican voting. Some people have tried to explain it through things like canals and roads, saying areas that benefited from canals, you can see here in the east a canal, some other canals over here, they would have voted for the Whigs because the Whigs were all about national improvement. But I don't see the connections when I look at the map. So I think that may be a little bit fuzzier. Some people, too, look at things like German population. And here's the Cincinnati area, areas of northern Ohio, strongly settled by Germans. Those tended to be the Democratic voting areas. But it's interesting, in Missouri, the German settled areas became the highly Republican voting areas. Partly this had to even do with things like, well, eventually with Prohibition. The Germans absolutely against Prohibition. And if you had a state Democratic Party, as in Missouri, that favored Prohibition, the Germans would go Republican. And it could be different in another state. So that was actually a real key issue with that constituency. William Henry Harrison, how long was he president? 1 month, yeah, not very long. We got pneumonia in inauguration and died, and we was succeeded by John Tyler. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. That was their campaign song, which critics said had rhyme but no reason, because Tyler was only in there because he hated the Jacksonians, hated the Democrats. Tyler was actually the opposite of most other Whigs. He was a very strong states' rights advocate. And most of the other Whigs wanted a strong federal government. Not so with Tyler. So that really sort of undermined the Whig position in this early period. I don't think I'm going to make it to 1900. Yes, question.
I double-checked the earlier elections, and 1840 was the first one where...
Thank you. 1840, the first time a candidate lost his own state. Fascinating, with Martin Van Buren at that time. The next election, election of 1844, focuses very heavily on the question of Western expansion. And it was set into motion by the revolution in Texas in 1836. Texas becomes an independent republic. It had been these areas of Texas heavily settled by Southern Americans, rebelled against Mexico, established the Texas Republic, and wanted to be annexed to the United States. That was a political controversy. And you can see the Texas actually claimed area all the way up into Wyoming. So Texas had bigger claims than what is now Texas at the time. Of course, they didn't actually control that territory. It was simply on maps. Comanche Indians controlled most of that area. But anyway, this was a big controversy for the political parties. The Whigs were nervous about it. The Whigs were nervous because they were afraid that taking on all this extra territory would, again, it would strengthen the western states. The Northern Whigs thought it would strengthen slave power, and the Northern Whigs, I should say, too, the Whigs at this time were divided between Cotton Whigs and Conscience Whigs. The Southerners were the Cotton Whigs, the Northerners were the Conscience Whigs, who were opposed to slavery, uneasy bedfellows. So the Northern Whigs were worried about this. The Whigs cultivated good ties with Britain. They were afraid this would antagonize Britain, and so they sort of prevaricated. They weren't sure what to do. Henry Clay was the Whig candidate, again, his third time. He didn't know what to make. He was sort of going back and forth, flip-flopping on the issue of annexation. The Democrats picked a dark horse by the name of James Polk, and Polk had a brilliant strategy of tying the Texas issue to the Oregon issue. Oregon country, including Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, at the time was disputed between British Canada and the United States. So what Polk said is, we can push for annexation of Texas. We can also push for expansion into Oregon, get what we can, as much as we can from the British. Ultimately, the area was divided, but the richer territories, the more productive territories in the southern part, it did indeed go to the United States. So here's an election where regionalism starts coming into play. And you can see the far western states at the time, from Illinois through Missouri, and southern states as well, very much in favor of the Democratic Party and its expansionist policy. And the Whigs, with Henry Clay in his third attempt, suffering from it again. Although the popular vote, you can see, was actually quite close. Again, the electoral vote doesn't look that close, but it's a different matter when you look at the popular vote. Notice here something else, the Liberty Party, 2%. Slavery is finally becoming a national electoral issue. People are up, anti-slavery forces saying, well, who are we going to turn to? The Whigs, the Democrats, they're both slave parties. They both have these strong Southern constituencies. You know, the Democratic Party, that was originally a party of Andrew Jackson that was most closely associated with the South and with slaveholders. And the Whigs had their strong slaveholding elements. So the Liberty Party taking enough votes in New York to take the election, to take New York's electoral votes away from Clay and give it to Polk. And do the math, 36 electoral votes, 105, 170, you know, that could have made the difference. So as in the election of 2000, a campaign getting only a very few percentage points can throw the election one way or another if that candidate gets enough votes in crucial states. Florida in 2000, New York in this election here. Mexican War that followed, well, Democrats win. Democrats want to annex territory. They want to take over Texas. That means war with Mexico. It was a popular war. Here's the congressional vote. You can see against going to war, authorizing the president to use military force to prosecute the existing war with Mexico. Interesting how it's framed. You can see there's the Western Reserve in Ohio. Boy, coming out very, very clearly. Basically, Massachusetts, a few upstate New York congressional districts voting against it. But this was a popular war that brought tremendous benefits to the United States. The popularity of the war, which also brought into the United States California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, vast amount of territory. And then shortly thereafter, treaty made with Britain to bring Oregon, Washington, Idaho, basically fill out most of the current sort of continental boundaries of the United States. Yes, that was popular, but the slavery issue is getting more and more important. And it's starting to tear apart the fabric of these parties. And in the next election, you get a new party coming out. The Liberty Party wasn't going anywhere. And the it was New York Democrats who split initially. It's interesting, the terms. They split into the hunkers and the barn burners. The hunkers wanted to hunker down with Southerners and keep the slavery system. The barn burners wanted to burn the barn of the Democratic Party to get rid of slavery. And Martin Van Buren, who had been Andrew Jackson's right-hand man, Andrew Jackson's magician. Well, some people think it was just because he was so mad at the Democrats for not nominating him in the previous election. But he joins with Charles Francis Adams, son of John Quincy Adams, grandson of John Adams, to form this new party, the Free Soil Party, that advocates free labor, free men, free soil, and so on. The Whigs go again to a military hero. That was the Whig strategy. Zachary Taylor had been a hero from the Mexican War. He had no political aspirations. He had no real political knowledge. He didn't really care much about politics, but he was popular for his military exploits. There he is, portrayed as the fighting cock, standing on the Democratic Party, what's left of it. And you can see the Whigs win again in this election. Zachary Taylor getting 50% of the electoral vote. You can see he did not get the popular vote because Martin Van Buren, his Free Soil Party, getting 10%. Enough to, that's getting significant. And very strong support for this Free Soil Party through most of New England, very strong in western New York, extremely strong in the Western Reserve, strong in Michigan, northern Indiana, not southern, northern Illinois, not southern. You start getting these states dividing into a north and south as well with this anti-slavery. Basically, you could draw a line about like so. Northern Pennsylvania, not southern Pennsylvania. Very, very clear northern pattern to this movement. But like I say, Taylor wins. Well, like all the Whig presidents. Well, the only other Whig president, William Henry Harrison. Taylor dies as well. He's succeeded by Millard Fillmore. I have to pause. There's a conservative comic strip called Mallard Fillmore. Does anyone see that? What's the connection with Millard Fillmore? Anyone know? I'd really, if anyone knows, I'd like to understand. Maybe it's just the name. Mallard Fillmore, obviously a duck. Millard Fillmore succeeding, sort of a hapless president. Millard Fillmore is president as this slavery issue is heating up. And under him, a compromise is brokered. Henry Clay, important in this again, the Compromise of 1850. It brings California in ultimately as a free state, but it also creates the Fugitive Slave Act. Here's a poster from Boston. Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all. You are hereby cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with police officers because they are now under orders to return you to slave owners if they can, because the Compromise of 1850 gave massive powers to the slave states to basically kidnap, if you will, African Americans in the free states. So you can see this compromise, it was meant to end the slavery issue. It didn't at all. It intensified it, as would all other efforts for the next few years. One thing that's what's happening at the same time is the massive migration of Irish and Germans to the United States. You have the Irish potato famine. You have the Irish basically starving to death. They're moving to the United States in large numbers. In Germany, it was the revolutions of 1848. A lot of refugees streaming to the United States. And a lot of these immigrants, particularly the Irish, and you can see how concentrated they are in New England, in the mid-Atlantic states, in northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, and later parts of the far west as well, tended to incline towards the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party at this time was welcoming of immigrants. The Whig Party was not. The Whig Party was suspicious and to a certain extent a bit hostile towards immigrants. There was a lot of anti-Irish animosity, especially the old sort of established elite of New England. That was the basis of the Whig Party in New England. They didn't like that at all. A lot of the Southerners were worried that this massive migration of unskilled, very cheap labor would undermine the system of slavery as well. So they were not favorably disposed. And then what ends up is the next election, the Democratic Party under Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire having another blowout election. Again, the popular vote not as unequal as the electoral vote. The Whigs again going for a general, Winfield Scott, not particularly politically adept, mostly chosen for his military exploits. The Democratic Party doing well with these new immigrants and having the most lopsided election since 1820. So very clear Democratic pattern. The Whigs now are collapsing. Yes, question?
So at this period of massive immigration, Irish and German,
yes,
what were the rules on citizenship and voting rights?
Yeah, the question is, what were the rules on citizenship and voting rights for the new immigrants? It depended on the state. Many states allowed immigrants to vote if they declared their intention of becoming a U.S. citizen. So many states made it very, very easy, and these were particularly states that had a strong Democratic Party who wanted to bring these immigrants into their party structure. Yeah, great question. Yes, in the far back? Yeah, it's an interesting question. Is the stereotype is that the Irish going to the cities, Germans going more towards rural areas. Certainly the Irish, most of them went into the cities. They were extremely poor. Few of them had enough money to start a farm. It took some capital. This was before the Homestead Act. Land had to be purchased, agricultural goods had to be purchased, and the Irish come in with nothing. And so most of them do go into the cities, not all of them by any means, but especially the cities of New England, mid-Atlantic states, some of the Great Lakes states that are now starting to build an industrial economy. A lot of them went into mining too. That's one reason why you see so many in the far west. They were railroad builders. That took them into some of the more rural areas. The Germans generally came with quite a bit more money, much better off. Actually, the 48ers, so-called, where a lot of them were political refugees who were highly educated. Not all of them by any means, but many were. Some of them were religious nonconformists as well. You get real strong German centers in Wisconsin, in Missouri, in parts of Ohio, many other areas as well. But I'd say both cities and rural areas. St. Louis, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, those became predominantly German, well, maybe not predominantly, but heavily German cities with German areas. And it's interesting to look at the voting patterns that reflect that.
I think the other thing that you can't discount with the Irish is that many of them settled in the cities where they would be closer to churches.
Oh, yeah, sure. The point is the Irish settling in cities because of the Catholic Church, which was not very widespread in rural areas, right, at all. Yeah, that's where they went. They did go into some of the southern port cities, but in the rural parts of the South, virtually none at all. It made for a real difference. Yeah, thanks for the comments on that. Anyway, the Whig Party is collapsing at this time. The Southern Whigs, the Northern Whigs increasingly don't see eye to eye. They had this electoral catastrophe using their favorite technique of a military hero. So that wasn't working at all. The Democrats are on top of things, but then lo and behold, they collapse almost immediately. The big impetus for the Democratic collapse was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This was something that was pushed Stephen Douglas of Illinois, Lewis Cass of Michigan. Their idea, these were Democratic senators who wanted Kansas and Nebraska to become states. Actually, Douglas wanted to build a transcontinental railroad. Some people say he had money invested in it. But their idea was that the Democratic Party stood for democracy. Well, we should say white democracy. And therefore, their most democratic solution is to let the settlers in Kansas and Nebraska decide whether or not there should be slavery in these areas. Previously, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 said no slavery north of 36 degrees except Missouri. So suddenly the Missouri Compromise is thrown out. The Democratic president, Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire, he is what's called a doughface, a northern man with southern sympathies. So he was aligned with the southern slaveholders. Kansas-Nebraska Act came in, and that led to what was known as Bleeding Kansas. That led to war in Kansas, as both the abolitionists and the slaveholders decided, well, the way to settle this is to settle Kansas. If we can get enough abolitionists or slaveholders into it, then it will become a slave state or a free state. The town of Lawrence was sacked and burned by pro-slavery forces. It was a war issue which then tears the country apart. So here's forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler, just to give you an idea of some of the imagery of the time. So anyway, this leads to war in the Senate with Preston Brooks of South Carolina attacking Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, beating him senseless with his cane in the floor of the U.S. Congress. over issue of honor. Sumner had made a very vigorous speech criticizing the slave power. Preston Brooks took offense to that and decided to settle it directly. Well, what happens because of this? The Whigs are dead, the Northern Democrats splitting, and a new party emerges, the Republican Party. 1854, Ripon, in both Wisconsin and then in Michigan, movements held where the old remnants of the Free Soil Party, the anti-slavery Democrats, and the Northern Whigs got together and formed the Republican Party. I throw this up because this is an anti-Republican poster of the same time, and you can't really read it. But it's accusing the Republicans of being vegetarians. This guy's saying that you're not going to be able to eat meat anymore, of rampant feminism. She's, you can see she's, it looks like she's, well, she has a twig in her mouth. I'm not sure what she's doing. Free love. This lovely lady is promoting free love, of abolitionism, of all sorts of what we would consider far left movements. That was the criticism being leveled against the Republican Party at the time. So you can see how things change over time. So the new Republican Party picks John C. Fremont. Drive around here, you see that name a lot. The Pathfinder, he was known as. Came into California, was involved with the war against Mexico. Became a very young man, became the candidate of this new party, and did pretty darn well. Had no support in the South whatsoever. Had very strong level of support in the far north, in New England, in New York, more northern states, and states like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, very much split now. And that divide is basically running through these central states. Again, with the northern counties voting for the new party, the southern counties voting for the Democrats. What happens, and here's a map showing, again, it shows up, and you can't see it here. Maryland voting for a different party. Did we see it over here? Who's it voting for? Well, look at the popular election. Democrat, Republican, American Know-Nothing Whig. Millard Fillmore, he's running again. Had been an unsuccessful president. He's trying again with a new party, just as Martin Van Buren had done, switching parties. The Know-Nothings, this was the anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant group. They merged with the remnants of the Whigs. Basically, what had been the southern Whig areas voted for this party. Maryland was not particularly a strong know-nothing area by any means, but Maryland, a slave state, not about to vote for the Republican John C. Fremont, strongly identified with abolitionism, and it ended up voting for Millard Fillmore. But that's a pretty significant section of the vote. Problem with the Republicans is, can such a regionally specific party win at the national level? No support even in the northern South, let alone the southern part of the South, none whatsoever. So that became the real problem. I bring up the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This is in Illinois, famous debates in 1850, partly because Illinois itself split entirely, with the North going for the Republicans, the South going for the Democrats. Yes, a question?
I noticed that California went with the Democrats as well. Why was that?
Yeah, okay, here's another case where the favored son did not win. California was actually very, very close. California had been settled by a very mixed group of people in the gold rush. There were a lot of Southerners. Later on, we'll look at some maps of California counties, and you can see that it was very sort of a county-specific pattern. The center of population at that time was actually in the gold rush, foothills of the Sierra Nevada. A lot of Southern sympathy there. A lot of the miners were Southerners. But it was very much a split thing as far as that goes. But yeah, good point on California. Thanks for bringing that up. I want to talk a little bit about the reasons why Illinois ended up becoming so split. And there's an interesting theory that some geographers have propounded, a geographer named Carville Earl in particular, who said it all had to do with the kind of crops they grow. He said in southern Illinois, they were growing corn as the main crop. And corn is actually a crop that can do pretty well under a plantation slavery system because there's a long period of time when the crop has to be worked, as opposed to wheat, which in 1860 is being grown in northern Illinois very extensively. And wheat is a crop where you have to work it really hard in the spring when you plant and really hard in the fall when you harvest. And the rest of the year, there's nothing to do. And so it makes no sense to have a slavery system with wheat. And therefore, wheat farmers were dead set against slavery. Corn farmers were ambivalent about it. Cotton farmers, you have work all year. Makes sense to have slavery. Now, I'm not saying I advocate this sort of crop determinism, but it's interesting. And you can see this burned over district in 1840 had been the wheat belt. They exhausted the soil growing wheat. Wheat moved further, eventually would be established in the Dakotas and Kansas. And that may have something to do with the distinctiveness of those tracts. What I want to show you on this map is to address this question: what's going to be the Republicans' future? Are they going to be able to make it as a national party when their support is all in the North? Well, by this point, here's population density. The darker, the heavier the population. You can see the population is now in the North. It's where the immigrants are going. It's where industrialization is happening. So more and more the country is unbalanced demographically. Or you can look at Florida at the time. This is 1860. Look how lightly settled Florida still was at this time. And you can see even parts of Wisconsin much more densely settled. Yeah, I'm obviously not going to get up to 1900. Maybe I'll end in the Civil War and we'll talk about it. 1858, the final blow to the pre-Civil War system, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. It had been litigated, I think, for 11 years. Dred Scott was a slave who was taken to free territory, I think ultimately to Wisconsin. He sued to get his freedom, claiming he had been taken to free territory. And the Supreme Court came with a decision that shocked Northern sentiments, which basically said the federal government has no authority to legislate on slavery issues, particularly in the territories, places like Kansas and Nebraska, not yet states, that the institution of slavery is basically protected by the Constitution. That was the final blow for the remaining Northern Democrats. Here's Stephen Douglas, who had been sort of probably the most important figure in the U.S. Senate at this time. He had been this real proponent of popular sovereignty. The actual people of the territory can choose whether to be slave or free. And here's the Supreme Court saying, no, it's a territory. No one can outlaw slavery. It's constitutional. That led to the breakup of the Democratic Party and the election of 1860. The Republicans with Lincoln sweeping the North. The Democrats split into a Northern Democratic Party, only winning Missouri and a little bit in New Jersey, but also winning the southern part of Illinois and much of the sort of southern part of the North. But the northern part of the North, more populous. And you have this complete victory here. You can see California switching to the Republican side. What was left of a lot of these old Southern Whigs had the Constitutional Union. Its only platform was, let's keep the Union and ignore slavery. The Southern Democrats, very much pro-slavery, winning in the South and even in Delaware and Maryland. Basically, this is a regional election. As I showed you this other one map I've been able to find of county level at this time. Here you can see the Northern Democrats, Stephen Douglas, but you can see the Republican areas. Again, there's our Western Reserve, there's our wheat belt, there's Vermont. And you can see basically two elections side by side. One in the North against the Republicans and the Northern Democrats, one in the South, the Southern Democrats and the Constitutional Unionists. The country has split. When you have an election like this, it doesn't bode well. And of course, the Civil War followed. We have 20 minutes. I think I will exhaust my voice if I keep talking, and it's always interesting to bring the class into the discussion. I was hoping to get up to 1900, but we'll just have to cover a longer period next time. But this is an important period sort of for the foundations of the U.S. electoral geographical system. Oh, look at California. Look how divided it is. Here's one state where it was really competitive with all of the parties. Western state, people coming from many different areas. It wasn't part of this national divide really yet at this time. You can see Republican voting areas in sort of the greater Bay Area. You can see some of the Southern Democratic voting areas as well, and some Northern Democratic voting areas here and here, depending on where most of the settlers came from. An interesting geography I'd like to learn more about. Yes, question?
What was the Republican Party's position on immigration?
Okay, yeah, this is a very interesting question. What was the Republican Party's? Yeah, I really haven't talked about the Republican platform, what they stood for. The Republican Party tried to have sort of a nuanced position. One reason why Abraham Lincoln was chosen, Lincoln was not one of the better known Republicans. He was a bit obscure. He had fame in Illinois from these debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but on a national scale, people like Seward, much better known. A lot of people thought he would be the candidate, but they wanted someone who didn't have well-known opinion on this score. So they didn't take a strong stance one way or another. They certainly didn't take what had become the Whig know-nothing approach, anti-immigrant approach. They tried to sort of soft sell that issue. And that became true for the Republicans, actually, even after the Civil War. After the Civil War, the Democrats continued to be the party of a lot of immigrant groups, particularly the Irish, particularly in cities like Boston and New York. What other parts of the Republicans differed from the Whigs on the issue of expansionism. Remember the Whigs tended to be concerned about the expansion of the United States. They tended to have sort of a foreign policy that was suspicious of overseas entanglements. In the 1840s, 1850s, it was the Democrats who had an aggressive foreign policy. A lot of Democrats wanted to take over Cuba and the Dominican Republic, to expand slavery. There was a concern that many slave owners thought that slavery had to keep growing. The slave area had to expand. If it didn't, the more densely populated North would win the day. So the Democrats really wanted to move into the Caribbean. Many of them wanted to take over more areas of Mexico. Obviously, it didn't happen. But the Whigs had been against these sort of involvements. The Republicans took on a more nationalistic, more assertive foreign policy, more inclined towards expansionism. How did Alaska come in the United States? Well, Seward's folly. It was Seward, Secretary of State, who chosen by Lincoln, who arranged the purchase of Alaska. So that was one thing that really differentiated the Republicans. And after the Civil War, the Democrats would become the party of opposed to foreign adventurism and imperialism, and the Republicans became very much the party in favor of a strong military and a strong foreign policy. So again, there's been shifts back and forth on that issue. Later on, the Republicans became isolationistic, and the Democrats became more internationalist in their orientation. So we can see these interesting shifts.
How the campaign was running at that time? I mean, there was no radio, no TV. So what was the method of spreading the word? So
what are the media? Well, a lot of it has to do with these pamphlets. I showed you examples of them. So the press was used. Political cartoons. This is one of the early heydays of cartooning and lampooning. But a lot of it, campaigning became a social event. Sort of campaign rallies, picnics, eat-outs, distribution of food. And this really came in the 1840s. This campaign of when William Henry Harrison came on, where the Whigs were trying to beat the Jacksonian Democrats at their own game. They really started pushing this sort of mass-based campaigning. Most of the presidential candidates did no campaigning. It was considered unseemly for them to do so. So they mostly sat it out. But by this time, you had strong political parties, and they were publishing tracts, printing broadsides, organizing local committees. And that's one reason why you get some of these hard to explain geographical patterns at the county level, because sometimes one political party would just sort of capture the county machinery more than another. And so you can't really explain it on settlement or economic grounds, but just seemingly by the parties competing for power. And there were some, again, and there were elections after the Civil War where there just wasn't much difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. They argued a little over the tariff issue, but otherwise, not much separated them, and they argued over personal politics often became the big issue. And these sort of accusations and slanders that became so widespread. Interesting question. Yes, in the back?
Was there any gerrymandering with the admission of these new territories as states between parties, and how they cut up the borders?
Yeah, the question is gerrymandering at the state level. Certainly gerrymandering goes way back to the very early years. It was focused on congressional districts more than anything else, as it still is today. As far as the state boundaries go, not to my knowledge. You can see, especially as we get into the West, they just start drawing lines on maps to make it as sort of simple as can be. Earlier states, you get more divisions based on natural features, but even there, the Mason-Dixon line, you can see, pure east-west line. So I'd say no, not at the state level. What there was up until the Civil War, this desire to have a balance between slave states and free states. So when we start seeing states coming in, we see slave state balanced against free state. We saw that when they broke up Massachusetts and created a separate state here in Maine to balance against Missouri coming in as the slave state. So that was the big obsession at the time. Later on, it's interesting. Under Benjamin Harrison in the 1880s, lots of new states entered: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. Republicans thought that these would be Republican-leaning states, and actually, over the long term, they did become. But immediately afterwards, they all bolted and voted for the Populist Party, a new party that was all in favor of silver miners and indebted farmers. So it was sometimes plans to bring in new states to help one party. Well, yeah, they backfired. They backfired at that occasion. Yes?
I think the gerrymandering started in the 1820s in Massachusetts. It was named after
Elbridge Gerry, right?
Elbridge Gerry.
Right.
Legislature designed some districts.
Yeah, if you can go on Wikipedia, you can find it very quickly. The question the answer, I should say, has to do with gerrymandering in the 1820s, is it? I didn't remember that. But a famous political cartoon showing this district looking, well, it looks sort of like a dragon, but it was said it looked like a salamander. Was so oddly shaped, hence gerrymander, creating that. We certainly have a lot of that going on. I think last week I showed you, I think it's the 12th congressional district in North Carolina, which is, it's more like a worm. It's an oddly shaped.
This goes back to earlier on. Seems like the decision to go from having only the electoral vote to allowing the popular vote would have generated a lot of controversy.
So moving from having the state legislators choose the electors to having a popular election generated controversy. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know about it being such an issue in many areas. Basically, this sort of tide of democratization set in, and people like Andrew Jackson were able to ride that, and then his opponents had to a certain extent, respond in kind. They had to move into the more democratic system as well, and to try to beat the Jacksonians at their own game. Hence the importance of the campaign poster and the hard cider movement and all of these sort of things. Interesting. I mean, why are we showing South Carolina like this? Because there's no popular vote. It's still the state legislature deciding. South Carolina, very much an aberrant state. The first to secede, a state that had a pretty substantial African-American majority at this time. Right after the Civil War, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana all had more than 50% black population. But South Carolina, it was close to 60%. And that led to the planters of South Carolina, the wealthy white plantation owners, to be very worried about possible slave insurrection, and it led to a very sort of aristocratic form of politics. Thanks. In the far back?
Yeah, with everything being so polarized right now, is there anything that's close to a bellwether state or a state that...
A bellwether state, that's interesting. Maine was, for a long time, was considered a bellwether state. That's really sort of post-Civil War. There was a saying, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. But then in 1936, only Maine and Vermont voted for Alf Landon. Every other state went for FDR. So the saying then became, as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. At the time, I'd say Ohio more than anything else, probably. And that continued to be true thereafter. Ohio just had this persisting pattern of these Whig and then Republican voting counties and the Democratic voting counties. Later, with industrialization, the counties would switch. The voting patterns would change very much, especially by the 1930s. Areas up in the Northeast that had been so Republican voting, these became the industrialized counties, and they became heavily Democratic voting. But Ohio has always been, almost always, one of these swing states. And I think there are more presidents from Ohio than any other state. I guess it vies with Virginia, which has more. Is it Ohio? Virginia has one more. Virginia has 8, and Ohio has... Anyway, Virginia, and Virginians are almost all from the early period. After Washington and Jefferson and Monroe and Madison, there weren't that many Virginians. There were some, but not that many. But Ohio, very important. New York was a really important swing state earlier on, and it would, after the Civil War, become another important swing state. The Democrats having a real strong machine in New York City, tightly tied in with the immigrant communities. The Republicans much stronger in upstate New York. And so New York became a real crucial swing state. That's mostly in the post-Civil War period. Missouri's an interesting state, too, because it's, again, like California, it's a state where all 4 candidates were competing, and all 4 candidates were winning. So Missouri is a state that is part Southern, it's part Midwestern. St. Louis has a lot in common with the Northeast. I mean, it has all these different sort of aspects, and it's been considered a bellwether state as well. And believe me, there's a lot of emphasis right now in our current campaign in the state of Missouri. And it's been tracking pretty well. Let's see, in ¡56, Missouri went for Adlai Stevenson, which was unusual. So sometimes it's been out of the norm. But in recent elections, it's been a fairly good bellwether. Yes?
Yeah, well, on that map, West Virginia looks like voting patterns are pretty much the same as the rest of Virginia. So how did they...
Well, that's interesting. You can see it's Bell and the Constitutional Union Party is doing very well in Virginia. Virginia, one of the southern states, if you will, to some extent, a border state. Slavery had been historically very important and continued to be very important, but Virginia also had pretty close connections with areas further north, and had long had some of these coastal counties had a more commercial orientation and inclined more towards the Whigs and even the Federalists earlier than that. And it was actually quite difficult. Virginia dithered a long time before it opted for the Confederacy. It was a touch-and-go issue. It was not one of the first states to join, and a lot of Virginians did not want to join the Confederacy, but ultimately the leaders of the state decided that they had to do so, and they did. The western part of Virginia, the western counties, did not want that to happen, so there was stronger sentiment for union in the western counties where there was virtually no plantation system at all. Especially when you get up into the northern panhandle, you're really into sort of a Midwestern region. And so the western counties then seceded from Virginia. There are many areas even in Alabama that were against secession. I have, if I can jump ahead, ever heard of the Republic of Winston? I was looking at these voting patterns at the county level, in the late 1800s, even into the early 1900s, when Alabama was part of the Solid South, voting almost exclusively for the Democrats, which was the party of segregation at the time. And here's a couple of counties, particularly Winston County, that was voting heavily for the Republicans. Well, one of several places in the former Confederate states where dissatisfaction with the Confederacy ran deep. Northern Alabama, poor soils, poor whites, little plantation. They didn't like this plantocracy at all. And so there was actually a legend that the county seceded from the Confederacy. I guess it's not really true, but it's a nice legend. But you can see the voting pattern. This is part of the point I was making about the not so solid South. Look at Eastern Tennessee. This is 1900. Look at South Carolina. Solid South Carolina, no doubt. Pretty solid Mississippi. But even Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, many of these states had Republican voting counties at that time. So it looks like solid at the state level, not necessarily so at the county level. And if you're from one of these areas, you know it's very important in understanding local geography. Yes?
When you show the slide of the population density,
yes.
What does it count? Is that total population, or is that 3/5 comparable case, or?
This would be total population, so it would be including the African American population. Here's the Black Belt in Alabama, South Carolina, most of both the coastal areas and parts of the Piedmont, very heavily plantation areas. So South Carolina is 60% African American at this time as slaves. So for congressional representation, they're only counted 3/5. But this is a map just showing overall population density. The white population would have been significantly smaller than that. And that's right about where the Republic of Winston is. Like I say, poor soil, not many people, poor whites, no plantation economy. Just didn't have the sort of the physical environment that would allow that sort of thing to happen. We still have about 5 more minutes. I'm sure there must be. Am I right on the time? Question in the back, yes.
What is the website access for that forum you're talking about? Platform?
geog05.stanford.edu. And then you can click on Join the Discussion, I think it says. So we've already had some interesting comments, and it'd be great if other people want to have more. I will tomorrow post some comments based on the lecture today to see if that can generate some further discussion. So I'd really like to hear from you, and people can join in who are watching this on iTunes University. We had someone from Venezuela join in the discussion already. So we're reaching out of the United States. Okay, I guess it's time to end the discussion. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.